Good evening, everyone. I'm Nicholas Demoncho, Head of Architecture here at MIT. I extend my thanks and welcome to all of you for joining us here for the first event of our Spring 2021 online program. Given that MIT still exists in the world in a physical space, which we are once again carefully returning to occupy studios and workshops, I want to begin with what is now our practice by saying the following. MIT acknowledges Indigenous people as the traditional stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which we sit now is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. I would add here, as we regularly also discuss in the context of land acknowledgements and acknowledgements of all the different kinds of difference we bridge to create this community, that words pale behind action. In this semester's lectures, we are connecting the past, present, and future in a variety of ways in order to act better as we consider this landmark moment in our history and our return to some sort of post-pandemic life. Here we are particularly delighted to welcome the work of Angelo Bucci and Julio Vinyaku into our roster of research studios this spring semester, tonight joined in conversation with Marco Cereto. Angelo will be helping to guide us in a multi-year investigation at the intersection of all our newness here as visitors in the America and the vast cultivated history and global resources represented by the Amazon. It's not my role to introduce Angelo tonight, even though as a good friend of a good decade or two, I'm delighted to welcome him again to MIT. Instead, I get to introduce a new friend, another valued colleague and the host of tonight's event. Cristina Parreño Alonso is an architect, designer, and educator at the School of Architecture and Planning here at MIT, where her research, Transtectonics, explores cultural, contextual, and environmental implications of temporal sensibilities in architectural practice. She's the director of her eponymous architectural firm and the founder of the Deep Time Project on Climate Change. Her work has been recently on view at the Shushev State Museum of Architecture in Moscow, and she is one of the architects exhibiting in this year's Venice Biennale. As well as her many other contributions here at MIT, she runs a series of option studios called Igneous Tectonics, focused in the volcanic landscapes of Chile. Seeing humans as fundamentally entangled with the environment, these studios offer alternative forms of architectural engagement, shifting timescales from the molecular to the geological. And it's because of the overlap and resonance between this work and the work that Angelo and Julio are accomplishing that we invited her to host this evening's event. So with that, I'll give the metaphorical microphone over to Christina to act as MC this evening and welcome you all and thank you all for joining us again tonight.
Well, thank you so much, Nicholas. It's my pleasure to be here tonight for this lecture by Marco Cereto, which I am very much looking forward to, a lecture that is part of, as Nicholas was saying, the Amazonia studio that is taking place right now at MIT, and that is being taught by Angelo Bucci and Julio Vinyaku, both of whom will be part of a conversation that we will have right after the lecture. I'm going to introduce Angelo, Julio, and Marcos, and then Angelo will say a few words before Marco's lecture. I'm asked to remind the audience that you can post questions in the webcast or on Facebook, so please feel free to do that. This is one of those where the preamble has a few layers, so I'm going to start right away with the introductions. I'm starting with you, Angelo. Angelo Bucci is a member of this family of MIT architecture for so many years already. We are so lucky to have him teaching regularly option studios in this department. Since 1989, Angelo is dedicated to building design, sharing his time between both professional and academic duties. Always based in Sao Paulo, Brazil, Angelo is the founder and principal in charge of SPBR Architects since 2003. He is professor of the School of Architecture and Urbanism in the University of Sao Paulo since 2001. And as a visiting professor, he has taught studios almost in every university you can possibly think of. I'm going to read only a few of them: UC, Berkeley, GSD Harvard, MIT, UT Austin, Yale, but also in Argentina, Chile, Ecuador, Italy, Switzerland, ETH Zurich. He holds a PhD since 2005 about the role of experiencing the city of Sao Paulo, and as an entry point to architecture. Thank you, Angelo, for facilitating this lecture. Julio Vinyaku, he is also family. Julio is an alum of this Department of Architecture. We are all very proud here. He's a PhD student in History and Theory of Architecture at Princeton University. He's interested in the interdisciplinary transformations between architecture and geography, and how exchanges between the two fields produce new epistemes in design, environment, and the planet. He has a Master of Architecture degree from MIT and holds 2 degrees from the University of Florida in Architecture and Geography. Currently, he is a curatorial member of the 2021 Venice Architecture Biennial. Thank you, Julio. Marco Cereto, our guest speaker tonight, is an architect professor at the Facultade de Tecnología at Universidade Federal do Amazonas. His work focuses on the modern architecture of the Amazon and its national and transnational connections with Latin American cultural institutions. His current research team includes works of Severiano Porto and his reverberations in the Amazon. He's the founder of Núcleo Arquitectura Moderna na Amazônia NAMA, editor of Amazonia Moderna, and curator of Exposição de Arquitectura Contemporânea na Amazônia and Amazon in Construction. Now, with that said, I would like to pass the microphone to Angelo.
Well, thank you very much for this welcome, Christina. I'd like to thank you, Nicholas, as well, to MIT. This is a studio that, as Christina said, that is being teaching by myself with Julio Vinyaku. I'd like to say very briefly, we took a studio as a way to understand the world through design. So a studio is a learning process, much more maybe than teaching, is a learning process. And this is why we were encouraged enough to take like Amazon as a site or a very specific topic in it. So, but I would like to just say as one issue that brings us even more encouraged to that, that nowadays we know what maybe we're not so able to realize before, that we can consider heritage, like if we can breathe the clean air that make it possible is a gift from previous generation. If we can cultivate the ground, the not poisoned soil is a gift from our ancestors. But from human culture in Amazonia, we inherit much more than this. A soil that was made much more fertile through each generation, and the air that is more and more breathable, as more that garden that we still call a forest became work of many generations that came before. So this is the kind of issue that is animating us during this semester. And finally, I have to thank you very much, Marco Cereto, that had his bio read by Cristina, but I would add as a Brazilian, and a colleague from Marcos, that he decided a few years ago to move from the south of Brazil to Amazonia. And just this gesture is a proof of his activism. So Marcos nowadays is a voice that represents Amazonia in a very broad cultural role. So to have him with us in this studio is what also make it possible. And to have him tonight to talk with us, it's a privilege. So please, Marcos, we are looking forward to listen to you.
Well, I would like to thank MIT on behalf of Department Head Nicolas de Mouchot for the opportunity to present the Amazon from a perspective of architecture. I thank Cristina Parreño for the moderation, as well as the kind invitation received from Angelo Bucci and Julio Vinyaku for this simple contribution to Amazon Studio, 12,000 years cultivation. We live in hard times when fighting science and exclusion of minorities are in vogue. Last year, the expression, "I can't breathe," became popular in the world with the tragic murder of American George Floyd Jr. This year, it was also used in Manaus due to lack of oxygen. In the capital city of the Amazon rainforest, oxygen is lacking. Like plagues transmitted by the first settlers to indigenous people, in the 65th century, coronavirus is the new threat to the Amazonian peoples. Our resistance did not start in modern age with Christopher Columbus. The Amazonian peoples have resisted for over 12,000 years. Brazil is a mixed breed country, mix of European, African, Asian, and indigenous. We are Americans, separated by the Andes and the Amazon rainforest, but united by rivers of Amazon basin. There are currently 275 languages and 305 different ethnic groups in the Amazon. The Amazon covers about 60% of the Brazilian territory and harbors a biodiversity vital to the climatic balance on the Earth. Contemporary challenges in the Amazon involve tackling illegal fires and mining, controlling the expansion of the agricultural borders, and protecting indigenous reserves. Conversely, the provision of infrastructure, sanitation, and housing and settlements is necessary to ensure the quality of life for inhabitants. There are 25 million inhabitants in Amazônia Legal. In a territory of this nature and scale, there is no uniformity. There are different cultures and, of course, different architectures. This lecture's approach is to show a panoramic view of Brazilian modern architecture in the Amazon, and in particular, the legacy of architect Severiano Porto. It is not intended here to present or defend any type of regionalist architecture. NAMA, Núcleo Arquitetura Moderna na Amazônia, brings together architects, researchers, and artists interested in the documentation of modernity in the Amazon. Also, the architects of NAMA design contemporary buildings, bringing reflections on the role of the architect and the criticism of architecture. In 1928, Mário de Andrade published Macunaíma, a work by anthropophagic movement of Brazilian moderns. Macunaíma is a character who was born in the Amazon rainforest, and he lived in a hammock. The hammock has an indigenous origin and symbolizes the universalization of something particular without a cultural imposition. In 1927, Ford Motors Company acquired land in the countryside of Pará State on the Tapajós River to produce the company's own rubber. Henry Ford implemented the monoculture of rubber trees in the Amazon, which became a failure. In the same way, the housing typologies and the materials adopted fail in Fordlândia and Belterra. Albert Kahn was the architect from Detroit and made a hospital in Fordlândia. If Henry Ford's company town did not consider the people who would work and live in village, in 1955, Oswaldo Bratsky carried out in the Amapá state the paradigmatic projects of Vila Serra do Navio and Vila Amazonas. They were inaugurated in 1960 before Brasilia, federal capital, for extraction of manganese ore in the Amazon. The Amazon is also modern. Bratsky took an immersion trip before starting the project to understand the Amazon and design solutions for urban infrastructure to building furniture. The village house did not use glass due to logistical difficulties. They were screened. Bratsky used industrial tiles with permanent ventilation systems. There is not prejudice against using industrialized materials, and they were used correctly. Relations between Brazil and the US were intensified with Washington Agreement signed in 1942. Large-scale rubber production was resumed in Amazonian rubber trees. From policy of good neighborhood emerged the exhibition Brazil Builds, New and Old at MoMA in New York City, a milestone for modern architecture. Brazil Builds also highlights the Brazilian Pavilion at the New York Fair in 1938, designed by Lúcio Costa and Oscar Niemeyer, distinguished by its fluid space treatment and its fresh detail. The Department of Education and Health building in Rio de Janeiro is a milestone of modern architecture. The polarity between north facade protected by the brise-soleil and south facades translucent against the light defines a modern paradigm. However, it doesn't apply to equatorial climate. In the Amazon, the sun reaches the four facades. In 1946, the United Nations invited 10 architects from 10 countries after the end of the World War II in Rockefeller Center in New York City to design its building. Oscar Niemeyer designed with Corbusier proposal was the chosen one. Its Brazilian modern architecture has become an international reference with Brazil Builds or the United Nations headquarters in New York City. It would also be in the countryside of Brazil. In 1942, some 6,000 workers from northeastern Brazil traveled to Belém by land. From there, on the Amazon River, rubber soldiers arrived at Seringai's rubber trees locations. Álvaro Vital Brasil built their resting buildings every 300 kilometers for workers to rest during a long journey. Functionality, constructive rationality, and logistics were keynote of this pavilion building constructed by local workers with raw materials. The building was handmade and modular unit for execution considered a side of a hammock. Nothing is more Brazilian than that. Álvaro Vital Brasil designed airports in Manaus and Belém, and he used industrialized solution with plywood parts, fiber boards, industrial tiles, and permanent ventilation to operate. Between craft work and industrial, Álvaro Vital Brasil proves distinction of Brazilian modern architecture. Erudite or popular modernity is a zeitgeist. The Belle Époque and Fordist architecture imperfection were the counterpoint to success in Álvaro Vital Brasil structural rationality and Bratic perfection design. These precedents were essential for Severiano Porto, as well as the indigenous culture. In 1965, he established a partnership with Mário Emílio Ribeiro and moved from Rio de Janeiro to a changing Manaus because of Manaus Free Trade Zone. Chabonos and Malocas are part of contemporary architecture in the Amazon. They are contemporary and continue to be built. Severiano Porto learned from Yanomamis a macro coverage, like a shelter, circular plan, and able to choose materials from the land and transfer his ancient wisdom to a formal language. Porto became the architect of the Amazon for consolidating Brazilian modern architecture in the Amazon. Porto states that architecture is building and experience the construction site as part of creative process. Now, I will show you some Porto's works built between 1965 and 1987. The stadium was a milestone of developmentalism, in the Amazon as the main reinforced concrete construction to date in the region. It was embedded in the land and eliminated a large span of reinforced concrete bleachers with simple support of these on the slopes. The strategy reduced the perimeter of the facades and overall cost of construction. Porto made the first house for his family in Manaus on a rented site in the suburb. He distributed a wooden pavilion with a sawmill treatment on pilotis for social and intimate activities, and the other areas in bricks for support activities. There was no glass in the frames, just movable cedar wood boards. Porto's house was a manifesto against the government's decision not to use this material for building in Manaus and reduce 25% compared to bricks building at the time. The design of Chapéu de Palha restaurant was done without sight. The choice for pure geometry and circular plan was made by wide possibility to adapt it to site. The low budget defined choice of materials and constructions technique. Araraquara wood was used as power energy poles in Manaus. The use of Araraquara wood without treatment and with simple fixation, as the carpenters were used to working in naval carpentry. The wooden pillars formed a conical shape of the building covered with busu straw, used by indigenous in their malocas and chabonos. The space division was traditional with bricks. The government agreed with Porto's request and allowed wooden constructions in the agricultural colony of Rio Preto. Nossa Senhora do Cavaco Chapel was the first experiment with wooden tiles, called cavaco, wooden chips, originating from Japanese constructions in the Amazon. Porto's second house in Manaus was featured by simplicity, instruction, and wood treatment with complexity in architectural composition. The trees were cut for construction in a location close to the site without industrial processing in order to avoid shear between the pieces joint. Wider sections were used compared to commercial ones. Such dimensions match the concrete structure. The wall's porosity was diverse and allow constant cross ventilation with different luminosities. Pillars made of Massaranduba wood with yellow glass gelosias and concrete cobogos framed the garden of Amazonian atrium. The Amazonian atrium was the core of the house and present contrast between open and closed, covered and open, light and dark, natural and artificial, handmade and industrial. SUFRAMA is an independent federal agency that represents Manaus Free Trade Zone. It is a symbolic milestone of the beginning of industrialization in the Amazon. The government hired Porto for a wooden building that would represent the Amazon. Porto stated that SUFRAMA would have difficulties. Porto stated that SUFRAMA would have difficulties in maintaining a public building in this scale in wood, so he built it in reinforced concrete. The proposal is structuralist, similar to production industries. Porto proposed a homogeneity between the admin functions in his project without formal distinction in functional hierarchy. SUFRAMA's modulus are 15 by 15 meters and are like tents with 4 pillars. The modulus cover has curved and arched slabs in reinforced concrete with a dome at the top. They are orthogonally juxtaposed, which allow a plan with depth without causing damage to lighting and ventilation. Robert Schuster Rican House is located in Igarapé do Mariano in Manaus. He requested a house with total environmental interaction. Schuster House is located on the highest part of the site with different topographic conditions on both longitudinal sides. The land contains 30 meters high trees. The vegetation that protects the house from the sun is a threat to a possible falling branches. These topographic conditions determine the asymmetry in two inclined planes of the roof and also in levels that configure the distribution of the house sectors in half levels. The structural mesh is 2.5 meters by 2.5 meters with a free plan open space on the ground floor and a cellular plan on the other floors. This condition requires a robust house structure. The structures that support this building load must also withstand any accidental load caused by falling branches. In 1968, Porto did a study for a hotel with 10 rooms in Altazes, in the countryside of Amazonas state. Porto's study had no site. 10 years later, Porto was hired to build a hotel in another city, Silves. Porto uses initial studies done for Altazes and adapts it to a new program. The covers, finish, and support structure are contact with wood, while some of the walls in wet areas with bricks and painted in white. Special wooden nuts are made to support reinforced concrete slabs in wet areas. The northern sector of the Universidade Federal do Amazonas campus is in an area of 500 by 500 meters, just like a Suframas building. Porto disagrees to use wood in the structure because in this condition, it isn't the correct material to build. The building is light and very inexpensive, structured by reinforced concrete with light and movable industrial panels. The roof used laminated steel profiles and industrial tiles. Porto experienced progressive concepts such as matte buildings, metabolism, and continuous growth of the campus. The macro coverage solution provides an alternative for weather protection of the construction site and guarantees execution of work budget in the financial year. In admin blocks, the program is vertical. The social areas are sheltered with macro coverage. The toilets and the canteens and the steel structure allow a free plan with displacement of the furniture by students. About 250 kilometers from Manaus, company town of Balbina was built to house workers for construction and operation of hydroelectric plant in the Amazon state. Balbina's hydroelectric plant has changed the geography of the Amazon and flooded an area of 3,000 and flooded an area of 3,000 119 square kilometers. And it is considered one of the worst environmental disasters in Brazil. In addition to the environmental disaster, it flooded the lands of the Waimiri Atroari and caused its population to be almost wiped away. To study this environmental disaster, the government was forced by the justice to build a research center and use thousands of trees that were getting rot in the flooded lake. Severiano Porto was hired for his experience in large-scale works with wood in the Amazon. The site has a slight slope, and the project is structured in two convergent wings. Along the street are labs, while more collected accommodations for researchers. The building is monumental and iconic. The previous experience with Cavaco tiles started at Nossa Senhora do Cavaco Chapel, at Schuster House, and at Silvis Inn, are elevated to another degree of complexity in a 6,000 square meter building. The freedom of shapes is not restricted to form, but at the different heights of the roof ridge that generate variable spaces that go up or down according to the program. For the first time, Porto's wooden building would be built by another construction company, used to major infrastructure works in reinforced concrete. Porto invited his naval carpenter, Elias Imbiriba, and along with the construction company, they set up a workshop to train local labor in wood treatment and construction. The construction site, with cranes and naval carpenters in harmony, shows a construction utopia of a fantastic architecture. The union of craftwork and industrial knowledge takes place in Baubina. Baubina is the masterpiece of Brazilian modern architecture in the Amazon. Although Porto is recognized for his brilliant woodwork, they represent less than 30% out over 300 works performed in the Amazon, experimenting with different materials and techniques. The choice of material was not an architectural part, it was a consequence of conditioning elements. What is Severiano Porto's legacy? NAMA has promoted 2 architecture exhibitions in recent years in order to promote valorization of Brazilian modern architecture in the Amazon and how continuation of this tradition can improve quality of life in the region. Third years and third works brought together architectures in the Amazon after Severiano Porto retired and circulated in 6 Brazilian capitals. NAMA made the first book with a record of this production. L'Amazonie en construction, l'architecture de fleuves volants is a small exhibition held in Le Corbusier's iconic Maison du Brésil building in Paris. It was the first time Brazilian modern architecture in the Amazon is presented in Europe. The exhibition shows a contribution of Brazilian modern architecture in the Amazon to the phenomenon of flying rivers. In La Amazonie em Construção, there is a tribute to Severiano Porto's works, and then Cité de l'Architecture et du Patrimoine award Porto with Global Awards for Sustainable Architecture in 2020 for his contribution to world architecture with his work in the Amazon. Porto was the first Brazilian architect to win such prize. La Amazonie em Construção presents a polarity between the fantastic and the concrete Amazon, with works that contrast an imaginary and a cosmopolitan Amazon. In this regard, the valorization of indigenous culture expressed in materiality in design are highlighted at Instituto Socioambiental Headquarters, São Gabriel da Cachoeira, in the countryside of Amazonas State, and Centro Sebrae de Sustentabilidade em Cuiabá, Mato Grosso State. While Brazil Arquitetura Office protects the roof and the facades of a 16 by 16 meter right cube with wood and piaçava straw, handcrafted by local labor, José Afonso Porto Carreiro brings to his architecture Xingus Chabono design at Centro Sebrae de Sustentabilidade. The use of indigenous design with a sophisticated technological solution with double reinforced concrete slabs protects the interior of the building and reduces 10 degrees Celsius in the summer. Porto's statement, architecture is building, is about the architect's needs to manage all the process with workers on the construction site. A community work valuing popular wisdom and local labor is carried out by Cristina Xavier at Centro Floresta Viva, Santarém, in the countryside of Pará State. Appreciating techniques and knowledge in construction in the Amazon. On the other hand, Gustavo Trabo, Pedro Duchenes, and Marcelo Rosenbaum hold workshops with children to carry out the Moradias Infantis program and quilting at industrialized wood techniques. If Lúcio Costa made the fantastic Brazilian pavilion in New York City, Costa did Thiago de Melo House in Barreirinha, in Amazonas State, as a gift to his friend. Costa made a house project in 4 A4 pieces of paper to Thiago de Melo, built with Porto's employees' help. Just like some of Porto's works in the Amazon, Costa has design without sight. As Costa shows the Brazilian modern architecture in New York City, he did Brazilian modern architecture in the Amazon. They are different but universal according to the site. Cristina Xavier, Gustavo Trabo, and Lúcio Costa, above works, use macro coverage used by Severiano Porto's works as a shelter for building and users' rain or shine. The permeability of the soil, the leafy floor with industrialized construction is a highlight by Porto at Universidade Federal do Amazonas campus. Laurent Trust presents these solutions at Campina Arana House in a gated community in Manaus and demonstrates that Brazilian modern architecture in the Amazon is powerful. The Belgian architect used steel panels and creates an oasis with a built landscape. In parallel to urban universe, Roberto Moita observes Schuster's house and Vila Serra do Navio and integrates architecture with natural landscape in a house for weekend under the trees at Sítio Passarim in Manaus. The connection between natural and artificial, Moita shows that Brazilian modern architecture in the Amazon is plural and possible in a union between industrialized profiles of Manaus shipyards with wood and concrete bricks as simplicity, again, Manaus shipyards with wood and concrete bricks as simplicity and sophistication of a hammock as a modern indigenous Brazilian artifact. The indigenous hammock of Vila de Monte Alegre, painting in 18th century by Joaquim José Codina, established a connection with a future modern life-made Brazilian architects and indigenous artists in the Amazon. Breaking the borders of the Amazon shows how the private can become global and reinforces how the Brazilian modern architecture dialogues with the modernity and tradition. It remains current and necessary neither for the exotic nor the folk, but for the quality of the architectures that legitimize it. Long live Amazonia Moderna. Thank you.
Well, Marcos, thank you. Thank you so much for this very inspiring lecture. Can you hear me well, Marcos? Yes.
Yes, Cristina.
Perfect, perfect. Yes, okay, great. So thank you so much for this very, very inspiring lecture. There is so much to talk about. Well, first of all, I'm blown away by this idea of the flying rivers in the Amazonia. When you say the architecture of the flying rivers, my mind starts flying, and I hope that we have a bit of time to talk about those afterwards. But before we start, and for those that enter a bit later, I wanted to remind everyone that this is a lecture linked to the Amazonia studio that is currently being taught at MIT. And please feel free to post questions on the webcast and on Facebook. We are going to have a small discussion here, Marcos, Angelo, Julio, and myself. And after 20 minutes or so, Julio will go through a few questions from the audience. And so now to start this conversation, Marcos, I would like to situate your lecture in the context or in dialogue with the Amazonia Studio and the Amazonia Studio within MIT architecture. And then, of course, to discuss these themes that you are bringing tonight in the context of the challenging times that we are living today, social challenges, environmental challenges, all of which are impacting Amazonia in very profound ways, as you were saying in your lecture earlier. And so I will take it where you left it in the long live to Amazonia Moderna, and ask you to explain, to elaborate what do we exactly mean by Amazonia Moderna. And the reason why I think this is relevant, Marcos, is because this concept is a constant of your lecture. And when we hear the term modern in architecture, we tend to think of an architecture that rejects the links to the past, that is disconnected from tradition, the architecture of the placelessness, the lack of identity, no, of the international style. And it would be good to clarify that these are really more Europe or American conceptions, and and that what is really interesting about the modern Brazil is that it comes with a whole new set of parameters, no, that give room to site, to place, to climate, to locally available resources, materials, knowledge. And so before we dive into the studio, with my first question, I'm going to ask you and Angelo. I'll get to you a little bit later, Julio, as well. But first, Angelo, if you could elaborate a bit more as well in about the modern architecture of Brazil, of which you have been such an important figure, and of which modern Amazonia is part. And to give us your perspective, Angelo, from the first-hand experience of your practice, including an important aspect that you add to all this, Angelo, which is the social component. And then, Marcos, if you could elaborate on its connection with Amazonia Moderna, no? What are the core values of Amazonia Moderna? It's the desired impact of this important work that you are developing with NAMA. And so, and beyond its academic disciplinary value, what are the lessons to be learned today in practice? We have many students today listening to us, and so what is the message for the future generations of architects? I will leave it there.
Okay, thank you, Cristina. Marcos, can I start? You are still muted. Yes.
Yes, Angelo, please.
No, just to, well, when I said that Marcos were an activist when he decided to move from the south of Brazil to Amazon, so his activism is very important for Brazilian culture, and mostly from this perspective, you know, to give voice to the production of architecture there in Amazon. So he is very much dedicated to this. So to see your lecture today, Marcos, is, you know, to me is, I have to say, you know, as a Brazilian, that even to me is very refreshing. I mean, because it's like to see the history that I belong to, the same architects that I know quite well, but working in a context that is not the mainstream in Brazil. And this is really, there is, for instance, one project that Mark showed us today, that is that one by Bratic, you know, in which he was not able to use glasses. And it is a fortune. I mean, we were lucky that the glasses were not possible in there, because it is this kind of lacking that brings solution that makes much more sense. No, mostly if we consider that the climatic condition there, it doesn't make important never to build a barrier between outside and inside. So the problem is not about insulation, but it's much more to prevent to be heating. And there in Amazon, you know, the humidity is so high that cross ventilation becomes crucial for providing good condition of to occupy. And but I would like to add one information that maybe could be your presentation made me think about, Marx. Now that is one fact that in Brazil, we say that the modern architecture has a date of birth. That is the construction of the Ministry of Culture in Rio de Janeiro. Now it's a very small group of architects. Actually, Lúcio Costa was invited to do the project, and he decided, so he could invite anyone as a consultant, but he decided that this person would be Le Corbusier. And Lúcio Costa was the director of the School of Architecture in Rio, and he joined like a group of former students of him, very young architects, and Oscar Niemeyer was among them, Burleigh Marx, Afonso Eduardo Ride. It was a very small group of people, but all of them became like very important architects in the modern architecture in Brazil. So this date of birth of modern architecture in Brazil is coincident, or at least the person is the same person who create our heritage, the historical architecture. Lúcio Costa was the same person who made both. And one figure that I would like to highlight in that group is the figure of Burleigh Marx. I mean, a landscape designer among the architects. And that person, well, he was, he produced a work that is remarkable, but Burleigh Marx was a person very much in touch with Amazonia, but I mean with the forest itself. He used to go there often, I mean to like expedition to explore new species. I like to say that he created a lot of species because those that were not known before him, and those species is about 30 species has Burleigh Marx as a scientific name, and he introduced those species in the design of his gardens. So it is the Amazon is part of the language in Brazil, of the landscape of the city in Rio de Janeiro, is part of the language of the landscape of Brasilia, and so on. So it's not one thing that it is detached. I mean, the most sophisticated level as Burleigh Marx could imprint it in it. So this is the kind of conversation that I think that Marcos is bringing to us. Please, Marcos.
Okay, thank you, Cristina. Thank you, Angelo. There are several papers that can contribute to the discussion about the different international style, Brazilian modern architecture, and such as Razões da Nova Arquitetura, Reasons for the New Architecture by Lúcio Costa, Modern Architecture in Brazil by Henrique Mindling book, and the researchers carried out by Carlos Eduardo Comas, Hugo Segawa, and Ruth Stein. But in general, international style was linked to the break with an artist tradition mixed with new construction technologies in general. Brazilian modern architecture happened in a certain way simultaneously with international style, but is supported by a generation like Angelo spoke of young architects who wanted to create a new architecture for the identity for a young country. Burleigh Marx searched a landscape for a tropical country, for Brazil. It's Burleigh Marx is looking for this landscape. And Amazônia Moderna is the application of Brazilian modern architecture in the Amazon. It started with Bratic, Álvaro Vital Brasil, and consolidated by Severiano Porto. I think the reactionary movements opposed to the international style in 60s were looking for the revival architecture that was connected to history and place and tradition. They did not apply to Brazilian modern architecture and Amazônia Moderna, which has always been related to Brazilian tradition and culture. I think this is the great difference. The Brazilian modern architecture, like Angelo said, is ambiguous because on the other hand, Lúcio Costa create with Rodrigo Melo Franco, IFA is the Institute of Heritage in Brazil. We are a mestizo country, and our architecture also.
No, I mean, I think this is interesting to see both in conversation or actually part of the same thing. Really, when you were saying, Angelo, that this is a group of architects that are working in a context that is not mainstream, but is essentially the same architects, right? And I think what I'm interested is this context that is not mainstream, what it is producing, right? It's producing a new world. It's producing a newness that happens in Amazonia, no? Like kind of they are entering and recuperating in a much more radical way ancestral traditions of understanding the land, for example, or the using of materials or resources in a very terrestrial way, right? And so I think when they are going to this like kind of very old ancestral knowledge, they are creating somehow architectural portals that connect us with the long timelines of the land, right? Or the long timelines of the old civilizations that lived in Amazonia. And I think that this expansion of time perception implies a much more sensitive relationship with the environment, or a much more sensitive relationship among humans, no? Among us sharing the planet today, but with the generations to come. And so I find that this is so relevant and that this is so urgent today, and that's why I'm so glad that the studio of Amazonia is taking place right now at MIT. And I think this studio finds a welcoming home here with the work that we are developing at MIT Architecture, the work of people like Brandon Clifford, for instance, Rania Goss, and Sheila Kennedy in Core 3, and many others, all working on expansions of architectural agency from the material, from the geographical, from the ancient knowledge. I am personally very interested, as Nicolas was saying, in the notion of deep time architecture that looks at the radically long-term impact of our human actions and thinks architecture as a geological force, right? That then needs to be viewed from geological timescales of perception. And so the question, and now Angelo, but also Julio, it's about time, and it's about time and about the Amazonia studio as it connects with the work of Marcos at NAMA. And I wonder to what extent you are going to work and how with Amazonia Moderna, and to what extent you are going to transcend those works and use them as those architectural portals that may take you even deeper into a perhaps more unfiltered past, right? And so I know you are bringing one of the most important archaeologists to your site in Amazonia, in Monte Alegre, which speaks about the long times or the long timelines, right, that you are working with, but also about the fundamental interdisciplinary work that you are developing. And so if you could also talk about these collaborations and specifically about the collaboration with the work that Marcos is doing at NAMA.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. Thank you, Marcos. The studio that Angelo and I are co-teaching, it's the first studio series on Amazonia. And like Marcos, we're looking back at our own history. Only Angelo and I are extending this timescale to 12,000 years ago. And so the purpose of the studio is to look at the archaeological evidence that has been found very recently that shows that Amazonia as a terrain has been much more cultivated, much more designed than we ever thought before. And it's been done so much earlier than we thought before as well. The points of evidence that we're looking at for this studio, we're looking at rock art in the site of Monte Alegre near the city of Santarém, which is not so far from where Marcos is in Manaus. But this shows, this site that we're looking at shows the oldest art found in the Amazon from 12,000 years ago. And this remains the core evidence for our studio. What we're trying to do in this studio is to reach back in that timescale, but also look at the archaeological, the material evidence, look at these layers that have been so far really quite hidden from us. And from us, I mean the School of Architecture, architectural history itself. And so I think what Marcos's lecture so beautifully shows to us is that Amazonia has had a long history of architecture and of modernism. And so for so long, it's been totally hidden from us. And we were just chatting with Marcos right before, but he was saying that even in his own university, where he's a professor at the Federal University of the Amazonas, his Department of Architecture is only about 10 years old. And so the history of architecture in Amazonia is new, and it's new to us. It's new to the discipline of architecture itself. So this is part of this project. We're uncovering this history as we're going along with the studio. We have to uncover not only the archaeological evidence that we're working with ETH Pereira, who's one of the premier archaeologists of the site. We're working with American anthropologists that have looked in this area, and what they're showing is that the Amazon has been totally cultivated as a terrain, and it's been cultivated and landscaped in such a way by indigenous populations for much longer than we thought, and at a much bigger scale than we thought before. The Amazon has always been a part of Brazilian modernism. It's just that we haven't really looked at it in this way. Angelo and Marcos were describing the work of Burleigh Marx, who was totally influenced by his expeditions that he went into the forest in order to excavate and find out and identify certain plant species that he'd bring back to his studio back in Rio de Janeiro. And then we also have even more radical examples of modern architecture as it relates to Amazonia, but also as it relates to this deep time, the longue durée of history and cultivation there. In the 1990s, Lina Bobardi, in one of her last projects, in a great political act, she wanted to show the archaeological remains of Luzia, which was the oldest human found in South America from 12,000 years ago. And she wanted to present this, her urn, in a piece of architecture that she designed for the 1992 Sevilla exposition. this was in order to represent the Brazilian nation and in order to represent Brazil in Spain. She was choosing to have a piece of architecture that was solely dedicated to the oldest human in South America. And this is to say to her partially European colleagues, because she was an Italian Brazilian, right, that human societies, populations have been a part of this story. And we need to finally take a look now and finally see this. And she was doing this in such a way that it was embedded in her modernist architecture. So they're all connected to us. And the purpose of this studio is to connect all these threads that are there for us. And so in part, what the studio is doing is we're researching our own history, our own understandings of Brazilian modernism, as Marcos is doing, but we're also excavating parts of human culture and human societies that are finally now being centered. And it's good to have Amazonia centered at MIT and in this in schools of architecture as well. You know, there's a quote that comes to me from the Enlightenment historian and philosopher Giambattista Vico, who in the 1700s wrote that this is the whole order of human institutions. He says there's first the forests, and then there's the huts, and then there's the villages, and then finally there's the academies. In this evolutionary order coming from the West, this doesn't really apply in Amazonia. It's first the forest, and it's still it's the forest and the hut and the city and academia all at once, all overlapping, all in one space. So this is what modernism in Amazonia means for us. It's all these overlapping tendencies and overlapping designs in this really complicated space.
This is really inspiring, Julio. I'm so glad to hear you speaking about the Amazonia studio. I'm curious if you could tell us about a little bit the specifics of the studio, Angelo or Julio, like kind of the ways you are thinking of the structure. I'm sure the audience is very curious about the work that you guys are going to be doing with the students in terms of a scale, or is there a program, and again the specific interactions with NAMA.
Yeah, definitely. So Marcos is part of our conversations and part of this studio. He's presenting to us in Severiano Porto and the Brachke and the other architects that he's showing us a way of designing in Amazonia that is different than we have thought of before. And the program of the studio is to design works that facilitate architecture that facilitates the preservation and the research and the exhibition of these sacred sites of heritage for us. So these are the evidences of rock art. Angelo talked about a cultural heritage that we inherit from our generations, from previous populations before us. And this is something that architecture has a role in promoting and protecting. The questions that Marcos brings up with NAMA, their work in preservation, their work in highlighting these architects in Amazonia are very much related to the studio. And so we're bringing in the technique, the knowledge and techniques and methodologies that Marcos is working with in NAMA. And so we would like to learn more about how to protect and preserve architecture in Amazonia as well. Maybe Marcos, you can explain a little bit about some of the conservation work that NAMA is also doing.
Thank you, Julio. Yes, these buildings of Severiano Porto this building of Severiano Porto and the modern Brazilian modern architecture in the Amazon was demolished. The big part of these buildings. In this presentation, only Suframas building and Universidade Federal do Amazonas campus
so only two buildings out of all the ones that you showed us
are available. Only two buildings. And NAMA initialized a discussion in a society to first to documentation these buildings, and then create in a society education for preservation to modern buildings in Amazonia. Sorry, I can't.
No, it's okay.
No, I think it's a great. I mean, it's a very important work of the preservation of the heritage of the Amazonia Moderna, and which has an incredible academic disciplinary value, and as you explained before, also like kind of a very important message for practice as well. So I think that we can learn a lot and from these works of architecture that somehow offer an interpretation of this long-term thinking, this deep time that I was talking before, and I find that the collaboration between you guys from Amazonia and a new perspective that may come from here. That's why I was asking before, like kind of the role of these works in a studio, to what extent you are going to use them as like kind of a springboard to propel you to these other ways of looking at the landscape, at the environment in more sensitive ways, or more time sensitive ways. I think that we can perhaps open the discussion to the audience. If I'm correct, Julio, you have curated a few questions from the students from the Amazonia studio themselves, which I'm very curious to see what is their insights. And then you will select a few from the audience.
Yeah, definitely. So Marcos, some of our students have some questions for you, and I'll try to combine some of these from our audience as well. So keep asking your questions there. One of our students in the class, Patricia, asks a question about Severiano Porto, and given the current conditions of many of his buildings, which are demolished or in modes of degradation, to what extent did Porto ever discuss maintenance and upkeep of his buildings? Did he ever have an idea of preserving his own buildings over time?
The wooden buildings are demolished because the environmental laws can't allow the use of wooden with treatment by Porto. In actuality, the wood used with industrial treatment, you cannot use today artisanal handcraft with wood, such to extraction the wood in the forest or use in a building. it's a very problem to maintaining the Porto's buildings with wood. But the reinforced concrete Federal do Amazonas, they are maintaining by laws of state, by law of the state. You cannot more demolish or change this building.
I see. So it's a state and legal
yes.
question of what is preserved and what's not preserved. But Porto himself, the very act of him using wood as a construction material is also a political response, almost a strike against the government as well, right? The other, there's some questions from the audience that are concerning questions related to concrete in Amazonia. So one of the questions asks why there are some projects that have we saw some projects that use concrete quite a lot. So in Porto we have the stadium and the university building. Was there and these are civic buildings, these were public buildings, right, that were done in part with the state. Was there a certain requirement from the state in order to modernize, in order to be modernist, they needed to use concrete? Was this part of the agenda?
When Porto came to Manaus, Manaus does have a Cereto. Cereto came to Venezuela, to Amazonia.
Oh wow, from Venezuela, yeah.
There is a first condition to Porto use wood in your construction, and he requests to government to use in public buildings wood and do not use reinforced concrete because doesn't have cement in Manaus. After 80s, the cement industrial started in Manaus, and it's possible to use in other buildings. But Porto's works, less than 30% was made by wooden buildings. Porto built with steel, built with bricks and other techniques constructive. Some researchers recognize Porto like wood architect, but Porto is more than this because buildings with other materials and techniques, construction techniques are unknown about the people. Sorry about English.
Yeah, no, but the message comes across very clear, Marcos, and I think that when you talk about wood in the context of Severiano Porto, we understand that it's wood because wood is what needs to be used in that particular moment, or what makes sense in that moment, and that's why he becomes interested in using that particular material. And what comes to mind to me is this example when Porto teaches, and correct me if I'm not correct, but because he thinks wood is the material that needs to be used, he needs to teach the construction company to use wood in order to build one of the major buildings in Amazonia. And I think that moment it's very revealing, right? And so, and this to me brings another interesting point in the architecture of Severiano Porto, which is this notion of architecture is building, right? And the idea that his company it doubles. It's an architectural company, but it's a construction company at the same time. And how that has happened in the history of like the great works of architecture, or the great architects, also engineers, like kind of it takes me back to names like Eduardo Torroja, Miguel Fisac, Felix Candela, Guastavino, all these from Spain, by the way. But there are also other construction companies, like for example, Eladio Dieste, also in the same type of family. Eladio Dieste from Uruguay, which by the way has worked with Severiano Porto, right? Like kind of Eladio Dieste was a construction company for Severiano Porto at some point, which kind of also talks about, again, collaborations or this the importance of finding the good constructor, and when you don't find it, you need to be the constructor or teach the construction company. No, it seems to be the mottos of Severiano Porto.
Yeah, there's also Rudolf Schindler in the U.S. Coming from Germany, that tradition, but he was building on site. He was one of the architects builders there, building in wood as well. So if we look at our own history of modernism, we'll always see wood coming through. There's there's a question that I wanted to bring up that's related to this very act of construction, the act of building, and also the act of transmitting this knowledge. Some of the students and also some of the audience members are asking, if you can expand a bit on the social and cultural aspects of Severiano Porto's work. How did he build this this construction knowledge? Was he working with local communities there in order to understand how to build with wood? Did this come from Rio de Janeiro or other modernist centers? How was it built? Was it a local knowledge, or was it from someplace else?
I think about knowledge. He was learned in Rio de Janeiro, and the knowledge he was learned with naval carpentry. Because when Porto came to Manaus, he don't utilize the details constructive of the Rio de Janeiro in Manaus, because the carpenters don't understand this, because the carpenters built by another way, by a simpler way, without many situations in the academic designs. And Porto agreed these details of construction of naval carpenters. And it's very interesting, because in this time it's not possible to do reinforced concrete like as Rio de Janeiro.
Yeah.
And Porto understand this and did the architecture with the way of the people of Amazonas, utilizing wood, straw, or other materials and construction techniques. join to the modern architecture. I think this is the more important about Porto, but he used above knowledge of Rio de Janeiro, a tradition of Brazilian modern architecture in Faculdade Nacional de Arquitetura, and mixed with the caboclo way of construction. I can answer all these questions by email after Julio.
Sure, of course. You know, a lot of a lot of our audience members as well. They're very excited to see this type of even hybrid works that Porto is showing, where he's mixing both indigenous knowledge with indigenous works of construction with something that is familiar to us in the modernist way. One person asks a question related to Nama is, but also related to Porto, is how did he use indigenous knowledge, and were there indigenous architects that he worked with, and are there indigenous architects now that are part of your group with Nama?
Okay. Yes, it's a good question, because in Brazil we have more difference, and indigenous people being architecture in last decade with government programs, but we have in Manaus a mixed people, like in Belém, like in Porto Velho, like in Acre. We all are indigenous, European, American, caboclo, and don't have a unique race. Don't have in Amazonia. It's a mix. It's a mix with many races. But in our university, we have many indigenous students in architecture. Yes.
Okay. I mean, I think this mix of like so many traditions and cultures, like kind of that happens so specifically in Amazonia, the mestizaje that you were talking about before, Marcos, translates very clearly to the architecture, right? Where the modern language, the modern form that comes from above is really mitigated, no, by these other forces or like kind of ways of expression that come from other cultures that perhaps in other more, I mean, critical regionalism or other types of sensitive modernism are not so prominent. And I think the architecture of Porto brings that like in a very clear way. Julio, perhaps we can ask one more question.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to, in wrapping up, there was a question related to this hybrid aspect, and the question I feel like finds its own answers throughout the rest of this lecture. But we have some questions from some of our students and from the audience as well, and it's related to whether Amazonian modernism is a lineage of Western modernism. Is there a difference between the two? Does one come from the other? Is it locally produced? So I guess for me, the answer we already see the answer, where the answer is always something that is much more hybrid. It's never purely a Western modernism. It's always integrated in some kind of way, but also coming from below, coming from techniques and methods of designing there. But Marcos, for you, what do you think about this question about the difference between an Amazonian modernism and a Western modernism?
It's a good question. It's a good question. I needed to think a little bit more to.
Yeah.
But I think we don't want to create a new school of architecture or a new style of architecture. The Amazonia Moderna is part of Brazilian modern architecture. I think this is more important. We don't looking for the style or are looking for. We want to do architecture like principles of the Brazilian modern architecture in the Amazon, in Amazonia. This is Amazonia Moderna. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I feel that, and the way you were putting it at the beginning, Marcos, it's kind of very revealing. It's like the Amazonia Moderna, no, as this entity that, or this way of operating that adapts, no, like kind of adapts to the context, and that when it operates in the context of Amazonia, produces like kind of a very unique species, which is this type of architecture that we were all getting very excited, no, when we were seeing them in your lecture. So I think it's time to wrap up and let our guest have a bit of a rest. I'm going to leave the final remarks to Angelo. So Angelo, if you want to share with us some final thoughts.
Well, before, I would like to ask your permission, Christina, to invade your house. Because I have to mention that, no,
Yeah,
you are talking from Lina Bobardi's house. So, and Lina, that was also mentioned here by Xhulio. So this Italian architect that was, this Italian woman architect that was so important in this Brazilian modern period, and who built this beautiful house for her here in São Paulo. And so it's amazing that you are talking from there. It is, and Lina, who had a relationship with also with Amazon, no? She wrote, or she used to say, no, how unbelievable and amazing for her was to imagine that we still had in Amazon people, indigenous tribes that had never been touched with white men. So it is, she always mentioned this kind of thing. And what Xhulio said is also beautiful, no, this scale of time for an architect, no, who was so impacted by that school that was found in Minas Gerais, 12,000 years old, the same age of the Rupestran painting that we are working or looking at the Amazon. So this school that that woman called Luzia, that had a very hard life, even very recently. She was burned one more time at the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro, but fortunately recovered. And now the museum will have a very much better story, because we had a competition that was won by an amazing group of architects. One officer from São Paulo, HNF, and an officer from Rio de Janeiro, Ateliê de Arquitetura. So Luzia will have a new house, a beautiful one. And the lecture by Marcos, no, it covers maybe Marcos a period of time that maybe is like 70 years, more or less 50 years. So it's much more recent. So when we are talking about 12,000 years, this period of time, it's the present for us, no? But it is, and this is in the present, what is beautiful when we are thinking about a studio is the present is the time in which the action take place. So the present is what condensed everything. So and if we are thinking about a modern way to look at the world or Amazon, we are a little bit guided, no, or mostly guided by our possibility in the future. So, I like to think now how our future is balanced by our notion of past. So, and Brazilian context really need a more long-term future to be considered. And so if we're talking about 12,000 years old, that doesn't mean that we will be able to know to think on this future with this time, but it means this is why in modern architecture, the idea of archaeology, it is very provoking for the architecture imaginary. So this is really beautiful, and this is the purpose, no, about to bring this time. And one more that for us, I think that made the purpose of our studio reverberating a little bit the same proposal that Lina Bobardis had in her proposition to the Brazilian Pavilion in Spain, that is to show that this place is made by the human culture, no, and that Amazon is not a jungle, that is not a forest, that is the work of many generations that came before us. And if nowadays we are able to breathe, it thanks to them. If that soil is more fertile than before, we have to thanks to them. So, and this is to recognize that as a heritage. It's one thing that made us much more able to prevent the disaster in the future that we were before. So thank you again. It's Marcos, to me, it was remarkable. You have to be sure that you are going to keep you very close. You are very important to our studio. Marcos was really generous because he opened a lot of connection for us in the Amazonian context. Christina, thank you a lot. Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you. Thank you, Hashin, and everyone.
Thank you, Marcos, for showing us that Amazonia Moderna is plural, and its history is plural, and its architecture is plural. We have so much to learn, and thank you so much for bringing your knowledge and Amazonia here to MIT.
Thank you, Angelo and Julio, for doing this studio. And I'm so glad that you both brought up Lina Bobardi. I'm a big fan of Lina. I've been living in this house virtually for months. So just to be clear, it's not for this lecture only. And Marcos, thank you so much. It's like incredible to have met you. Thank you everyone for coming to this event this evening. We hope you will join us next Thursday, March 4th at 6 p.m. for a lecture hosted by the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture, Surveying Modern Architecture, the Case of Cairo, by MIT architecture alum Mohammed Kamal El-Shahed. See the full list of upcoming events in architecture.mit.edu, and we hope we will see you very soon. Thank you.